Hey, listeners, welcome back to the Rise and Form podcast. We met with Dr. Katherine Thompson today. Let me tell you a little bit about her and what's coming up in the show. Dr. Katherine works in mental health as a social worker and a therapist in private practice, and she's also a senior lecturer down in Melbourne, Victoria. A beautiful part of the world, I must say. She lectures in mental health and wellbeing at the Melbourne School of Theology and at Eastern College, Australia. I was so happy that we were able to sit with her and really just be able to glean insight from her on peace and applying that idea from the fruit of the Spirit to suffering. Just a beautiful conversation. I hope it really blesses you. Let's dive in. G'day, and welcome back to another episode of the Rise and Form podcast. The podcast that has real talk about forming your character with actually useful psychology.
We're an unlikely duo of an American psychologist and an Aussie psychologist who both love theology and the science of change.
So grab a chair and a hot cup of coffee and open your heart and mind to the conversation.
Please follow us on Instagram and Spotify or Apple. That way you can find us easy and know when we post our next episode.
Now on to the show. Yeah, let's do it. Let's dive in.
Get it. All right. So I'm going to ask you our first question that we ask everyone, which is basically tell us a formative moment when you experience the peace of God.
Yeah. I actually grew up in Tasmania, which is like the southernmost part of Australia. And I don't know, some of your listeners will probably identify with my growing up experience because for us, going out hiking is just like normal. It's almost built into you, and it's easy to get out into nature. And like I grew up, and we had a view of the ocean from the house, and we lived on a steep hill, and we'd go out into nature all the time when I was a child, and we'd do lots of hiking, so mountains, beach, lots of national parks, fantastic. So there is something in me that always connected to God and found that peace, I think, in being in the natural world, and it's just part of who I am. So it's really not a surprise that then I ended up writing the books that I have because it comes out in the books I write. But this year I had a bit of a formative thing that I was struggling with because I was having a tough time, and this isn't in the book, but it just shows that life continues to evolve. And so a close friend of mine she works for the Bible Society in Australia, and she sent me this picture out of one of their Bibles, like the Good News Bible had those little cartoons in it. And it's based on the story about Jesus and his disciples in the boat in the storm out of the Gospel of Mark. And she was pointing out to me in the little picture the artist had drawn that there's one guy that's hanging on with all his strength to the mast, and it's like he's going to blow away. And then I puzzled about the picture because I'm like, something about this is just not right. And there were whoever did the drawing had a sense of humor because some of the disciples were actually, we call it throwing up, but they were being sick over the side of the boat as well. And so there was all these like little narratives that you could see in the picture. But thinking about this guy hanging onto the mast, and I thought, hey, that's actually not the way that's not correct theology about peace. So when we think about going through suffering and storms, I have realized it's about letting go of the mast and letting go of control. And if you read that passage in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is saying to them, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? It's not that they lacked faith the rest of the time, but in that moment it got a bit wobbly. And, he was not stressing at all about the situation, which is quite funny if you really think about it. And so I think this is the discipline of learning to have peace while you're in suffering, is to let go and to actually just have that trust that God's got the whole thing under control, which is something you have to learn.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely.
Man, Okay, yeah, we got to dig all into that because I can just
Yeah.
hear people now like let go and like the obstacles to
Mm,
letting go. But I see what you're saying because it shows a trust. Like peace is really predicated on this trust in the other person who is
yeah.
Christ, who is God. So
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, yeah. My heart rate went up as you were saying it, because like, yeah, where's my faith,
Mm,
But it's because that's scary
mhm,
to just let go
Yeah.
and hope that,
mm,
or trust that he will catch you.
yeah,
And I think in like even daily, almost everything we do from getting up in the morning just to getting the kids into
mhm,
daycare or working, like just going to work or whatever it
Yeah.
is, like I'm often holding on tight, right,
mhm,
to the mast. And
mm,
so I was laying on the beach in Australia like just a week or so
mm,
ago, and I was holding onto the mast so tight while I was trying to relax,
Mm.
mhm,
and truth kind of
mhm,
dropped into my mind. It's not, you can't do this. Like it's not about, you can't make these things happen, um
mhm,
and just sort of like had a song in my head that I've never heard, but it was like him saying, I make all things new.
mhm,
And I was like, oh, that's all I got to do is just, you make everything new. I can't make everything
Mm.
new. So thanks for that. Like that was
yeah,
such a powerful thing. And
mm,
it sounds like you're almost defining peace as you talk about that, like what it actually is, and that it's sort of
mhm,
synonymous with
mhm.
trust. So I'm wondering if you can give us a bit of Dr. Catherine's definition of peace, however you describe it.
I haven't actually thought about that. Like I tend to think in pictures, so it's probably why this picture
Mm,
really got under my skin and I had to make
Mm,
sense of it.
mm,
But
mhm.
the New Testament and especially the Gospels are full of pictures, aren't they? So
mhm,
the
Yeah.
other one that really brings home this point is the story about Mary and Martha and how
Mm,
Jesus is saying to Martha, like, stop stressing about all this stuff. Like, why are you running around so busy and worrying about all these things? That's not what is
yeah.
important. And Mary chose the right thing, which culturally was the wrong thing. So it's actually significant that
Mm,
she was doing the wrong
mhm,
thing. But for her,
mhm,
she was just choosing to sit and listen.
mhm,
And when I think about myself, when I get really uptight when something's going wrong in my life, that image grounds me because I'm like, no, you need to stop and when
mm,
things get really bad, you need to do the opposite to what you feel like
mhm,
doing. And you need to
mm,
just sit still and just sit at Jesus' feet and listen and not panic.
mm,
Because we normally panic,
mm.
don't we? We're like, help.
mhm, mhm,
Yep.
mhm. When I'm in therapy, when I'm sitting as the therapist and I'm with a client, and sometimes I notice, like, I'm not quite breathing or I'm clenching in my stomach just because it's like, "Oh, this feels like a lot. How am I gonna help them?" And I get up into my own head.
Mm,
And there's times where I have to,
mm,
like, just take a deep breath and, like, remind myself, like, "I am not alone in this. God is the co-therapist." And it's like that kind of is reminding me of this idea of, like, the letting go of, like, literally, I have to let go of my breath, in those moments
mhm,
and trust him,
mhm,
and there's times where it's like, "Okay, I don't quite know where this is gonna go, but I gotta trust that God is gonna take this somewhere," you know?
mm. Cast all your cares upon him. Scripture came to mind as you said that.
Mhm.
Like it's, and because he cares for you, and the peace of God will
Mhm.
transcend all understanding
Mhm.
and guard your hearts. How do
Mhm.
I
Look
remember that
at
right now?
you! Yes.
Let's go. That goes back to high school, I think. But like one of my memory verses from my mentor. But maybe one of the practices there, and we're going to talk about that later, is to just do that, like to cast your cares, or and maybe that's what you were sort of saying there too, Dr. Catherine, just about just being reminded who has you, like who's fighting the battle, and it's not your battle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the battle analogy is a really tricky one, isn't it? Because that
Mm.
sort of forces us back into that control sort of mentality.
Mm, mm,
Mhm.
But
mm-hmm.
actually, it's the opposite. It's about letting go. So when you're sitting
Mm.
and
Yeah.
listening, you're actually letting go of everything and just
Mhm.
Yeah.
listening.
Wow.
And as therapists, when we're Christians, I think that's the unique thing that we bring into the therapy space because our clients are often quite distressed, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
they've usually got a really good reason for why they're distressed, and we absorb all of that.
Mm,
But the unique thing that we have is that the Holy Spirit's working in the conversation and guiding us. So sometimes I think that our work is simply an extension of the sitting and listening, but we're
Mhm.
listening to God through the Holy Spirit and the client simultaneously.
It's
It's a
good.
lot to do. It's like, all right.
I know it's not that
It
simple.
isn't. It isn't.
It's like it's so simple, but we
I
make it
know.
so it's quite a skill, isn't it,
Yeah.
to listen, to actually listen to
Yeah.
things,
Yeah.
to God and other,
Yeah, and that's why
yeah.
it's a discipline, I think. So it's a bit of a risk to call my book The Discipline of Suffering, because in
Mm.
Western culture, well, especially in Australia, we read the word discipline and we're like, ugh, who'd want to do that? Like, that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
That sounds
Mhm.
like
Oh, yeah.
hard work that I'm not going to enjoy.
Yes.
But the
Mhm.
discipline, it
Yeah.
speaks a bit more like how we'd use it in being connected to the present moment. It's about choosing to do it
Mm,
as opposed to
Mm.
it being a
mm.
chore, because there's a big
Mm.
Ah,
difference.
got you.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I
choosing to
like
do
that,
it.
and that kinda, brings up this question of, like, the mindsets that you need, and you talk about that in your book, the discipline of suffering and, the
Mm,
different narratives that we create, and this is more so, like, in times of pain, but I also wanna hear, the side the narratives that will help us choose to, but first, can you
mm,
elaborate on the first part of it, of, like, the narratives of pain and suffering
Yeah.
and and how that impacts us, and then ultimately our experience of peace?
mm,
Yeah, it's such a helpful thing for people to realize that it's normal human experience if you have pain or suffering for
Mm,
your mind to literally fill up with the problem. And it gets to the point where you can't see anything except the problem. And it
mhm,
doesn't
mm,
mean that
mhm,
you've got a mental health issue. That's just going to happen anyway.
mm,
And so if it
mm.
becomes really toxic and problematic, it can lead to things like depression, anxiety, other things. But
Yeah.
it doesn't
mhm,
have to. It's just part
Mm,
of us being human beings. And I think it's helpful to make that normal for people so they don't
mm,
feel judged or inadequate or like there's something wrong with them, because I
mhm,
think with suffering, it brings a whole layer of shame. Like Brene Brown's great at talking about shame, isn't she? And so
mm,
I think a
mhm.
lot of her work's really helpful in this space, that it's not good for us to hold that in our mind, like
mhm,
to get it out. And in the book, I
Mhm,
use narrative therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy as a bit of
mm,
a helpful
mm,
framework to integrate with how we see our faith and God in the suffering, because it
mhm,
mm,
encourages us to get the instead of just seeing the problem like it's here, we actually
mm,
start to get a
mhm,
bigger perspective of our life and step back
mm.
from the problem. So in
mhm,
narrative
Yeah.
therapy, that's called having a problem saturated view
mhm,
of your situation.
Mm,
And
mhm,
so
mhm,
as therapists, we often try to move people so that they get unstuck out of that place,
mm.
so that they can see that there's other possibilities.
mhm,
And in
Yeah.
our Christian faith, without it, like before narrative therapy existed, we had tools that
Mm,
we have sort of not used well, or we haven't adapted or brought into the current age very well.
mhm,
Um,
mm.
and so one of them is just a biblical example of Paul. And
Yeah.
I talk about it in the book, and how he was a completely different person pre and post conversion. But
Mm,
one of the things that narrative therapy does to try to stop people being problem saturated, it tries to give the problem a name. But in Paul's case, his actual name changed. So
mhm,
he got
wow.
a new identity, and that was a really
Mm,
necessary
mhm.
shift for him to go from this horribly, well, the early Christians would have seen him as a horribly judgmental, dangerous, murderous person that was out to get them, to
Yeah.
someone that was
yeah.
actually one of their church leaders, or became that, and a
Mm,
missionary, and one of the most influential Christian thinkers of all time, right?
Mhm,
So
mm,
and it's
mhm.
interesting in his formation that suffering and sharing the good news actually partner together. So
yeah.
that's an example
Yeah.
from the New Testament. But then we've got
Mhm,
lots of other Christian
Yes.
literature that helps us. Like one of my favorite books is called Heinz Feet in High Places, which was written by a missionary last century. And
Mm,
it's an allegory, a bit like Pilgrim's Progress. And
mm,
the main
mm,
character's called Much Afraid. And she goes on
mm,
mm,
this journey because she is suffering, and part of her story is feeling like she's caged in her house and by her family, and she is scared of everything and gets called by the shepherd to go on a journey. So she goes on this journey, and it goes through a really indirect and winding route, and she learns all these important lessons like acceptance of suffering and things
mm.
like that. But
Wow.
in the process heals, and
Mm,
she then gets given, like Paul, a new name. So she starts off being
mm,
called Much
mm,
Afraid. And
mm,
then at the end of
mm.
the book, her name is changed to Grace and Glory, which is exactly what
mm.
happens
Mm.
to people that
God,
come through to the other end of their suffering as a Christian, I think, that
Yeah.
they
man,
actually change
man,
their whole character. And
Mm,
so
gee,
the shepherd gave her two companions at the beginning of her journey called Suffering and Sorrow.
mm.
And
mm,
then at the end, they transformed to peace and joy.
Hmm.
So I think
Oh
yeah,
my
that
god.
suffering and peace actually are intertwined, and you can't avoid
yeah,
that.
yeah. I'm just, yeah. No, you go.
Real quick, what was the name of that book? Because I think that would be a great
Mm,
book. I just
mm-hmm.
for these concepts to be so deep and to have it in allegory form.
Yeah.
What's the name of it
Oh,
again?
yeah.
Yeah, it's called Hind's Feet in High Places.
Mm, okay. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. Okay, Abe, you go.
But then you can also
Yeah.
access more modern things like The Shack is another allegory, which
Oh,
is
Yeah,
more
the
up
yeah.
to date, and
mhm,
it'll teach a
Yep.
different lesson. But there's all these other resources out there. If you realize they're connected to this problem, they can
Mm,
actually
mm-hmm.
help people because they give you a different way of thinking about things.
mhm,
Oh,
mhm.
Yeah.
absolutely. I'm wondering if we should slow down on the word suffering for a
Yeah,
moment as well,
yeah.
like, because I think people might hear that and not think that they're suffering, and some people might think they're suffering, and maybe they're not the way we're describing what suffering
Mhm,
is. And I know that's a tricky thing to even try to like open dialogue up about because it's so subjective
mhm,
and but maybe in your own experience
mhm,
there, Dr. Catherine, just on what suffering has been and because I think for me, when I've named that I'm suffering, it's actually been helpful. Like, and
mm,
knowing that suffering is good, it's probably refining me and it's probably taking me to a place of acceptance of things
Mhm.
I can't control, a place of peace, a place of
yep,
reliance on God, getting over
yep.
myself. I've heard that suffering is delayed obedience sometimes,
Mhm,
which in my life absolutely has been like,
mm.
I'm suffering. Oh, it's so bad. It's like, it's because I was an idiot. And, I just needed to. So, yeah,
Mm,
any thoughts on like what you would sort of throw in the arena of what suffering actually
mm.
is?
Yeah, that's really hard to define. Thanks for
Yeah,
that
sorry.
challenge.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it wasn't in the
Just I
question.
know.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, and that's okay. I mean, that maybe that's part of it, right? Just it's hard to define,
Yeah,
and that's fine.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
but I think there are important things that I could draw out of what you were just saying. Um, as
Yeah.
therapists, sometimes we see that our clients that come in for help and talk to us, they have a problem, but then what they're doing to avoid the problem or to deal with the problem or control the problem is actually increasing their suffering. And
Mhm,
Mm,
that's unhelpful. So I
yeah.
would love, well, part of our job and part of what I write about is to try and get people to move out of that because that's really toxic.
yeah.
Um,
Mm, mm,
I think you could broadly describe suffering as anything that is distressing us, or
Mm,
yeah.
so it could be something that looks small, but to us it might not be. And it could be something
Mm,
unexpected, or it
yeah,
could be something really
mm,
huge. So
yeah.
um, I think it's very individualistic, especially in Western
Yeah.
culture. How we perceive our situation is really going to define if we think it's suffering or not. And I don't think it's really helpful to judge that.
Yes.
It's more about trying
Yeah.
to listen to people and hear what that situation is.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's
That narrative
mhm,
approach is so important, isn't it? Like the way you tell
mm,
the story of where you're at and how sometimes the story itself is what's causing you a lot more pain.
mhm,
Like you said, a problem saturated narrative. Yeah. And some of the tools that you have to help people understand maybe the greater narrative or the biblical view or God's view of what's happening, or
Mhm.
how that can be so helpful. So many people come to mind, or clients come to mind as we talk about this.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
and I appreciate the piece too of like not judging suffering, not judging the suffering of others because it is subjective, not just judging your own suffering because sometimes we can dismiss our own suffering and like, oh,
Yeah.
it's not this or that doesn't compare to someone else, and that just only just gets us stuck, in it,
Mm,
and we're not moving through that. Probably is a form of avoidance in a way, of avoiding the actual
mhm.
problem, which we're saying is
Yeah.
actually contributing to it. So how can we hear people well and trust them and believe ourselves when there are signs of suffering in our lives?
That I think we're vibing on this, Andrea, because I was thinking of
Mm,
avoidance and how, and all of the defenses, right? Like
yeah.
you were sort of talking about minimization there,
Mhm.
and just how Dr. Adam Dell, he was talking about that being like avoidance of slaying the dragon or facing
Mhm.
the thing.
Mhm. Yeah.
And, that's usually because we're afraid, right?
Yeah.
We're afraid to face the thing. Or the thing is like unfaceable. Like, how do you face something that's causing you so much
Mhm.
pain? It's so we do avoid it because there's nowhere else to go, sort of thing. Like, where do we go?
Yeah.
And
Such a Western culture
mm,
problem, isn't it? Because
Mhm.
we think suffering's bad. Like we have this
Yeah.
um, unspoken rule that suffering's bad. We're meant to be happy.
mm,
So that's
mm,
true for the country that you guys are in, and it's true for mine as well. And there's variations, even though our cultures are slightly different. And I
yeah,
don't think that's biblical. So you see the life of
mm,
Jesus, it was full of suffering.
Yeah.
You see the life of
mm,
Paul, it was full of suffering. So
mm, mm.
it's our culture that tells us that, and we have to be very careful to realize that
Wow,
that's not necessarily a helpful way of seeing the world.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
good.
absolutely, absolutely.
S-
It sets the
Yeah,
wrong expectation then because it's like, "Oh, something is wrong with me, something's wrong with the situation," but, that this life does have suffering and
mm,
various trials that God can and will
man,
use to shape us, but you're so right about that perspective of, like, it in the Western world where it's seen as a negative, because I remember growing up, a pastor did a sermon on why Christians shouldn't suffer, and it would be so interesting to listen back to it now, but even the title
wow,
itself is like,
yeah.
"Ah, I don't know if that's biblical," like you're
That's
Hmm.
saying,
yeah, it's pretty.
like, are we if
It
we're
seems
following
pretty.
Christ, then there will be suffering, but we, aren't bound by that, we're not defined by that,
Mm,
but yeah.
So, like parenting, right? Because it's kind of like if we have in our mindset that our job as parents is to have happy
Mm,
children,
mhm,
you know, that becomes like sort of that when they're not happy, something's wrong, right?
mhm.
And so that can become our template growing up. If I'm not happy, something's wrong,
Yeah.
because that's what mum and dad, or our parent was trying to instill in us. And I'm thinking like I'm just getting a little like convicted, or like kind of trying to think through that right now
Mm,
about how that permeates my thinking, right? I mean, and maybe listeners too would be like, so what do we do? How do we show our children?
mhm.
And maybe this is our churches, or maybe this is our clients too, right? Our children, but how do we show them what walking Christ-like life is,
Mhm.
if it's not necessarily happiness? Um, and it's not like being a sucker for punishment either, right? It's not about like
Yeah.
necessarily pursuing punishment.
Mhm.
I don't really know where I'm going with that. I'm just sort of thinking about it because, like, when my son's not happy, I'm like, poor guy, It's like I
"No,
want him to
feel
be,
better.
yeah,
Oh, I don't want you to feel
Mhm.
yeah,
pain, but then you also are not going
yeah,
to grow, and you're gonna be dependent on me, and I'm not gonna like that in 18 years,
yeah.
so
Yes, gonna need you to,
need you to find
But
your way."
yeah,
is it a bit
yeah,
about taking a leaf out of Paul's book and saying, like, I'm not very good at remembering Bible passages without searching them on Google, but he
same.
talks about how suffering produces perseverance, and
Mhm.
perseverance character,
Yes.
and character hope.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
more about thinking about, well, what character am I building through this experience, and how am I growing,
Boom.
and
Mhm.
how's my
Yeah.
faith growing, rather than seeing it as, oh, I'm not
Yeah.
happy, you know?
Yeah.
Yes, yes,
There you go. I mean, can we just, like, write that down? That's
yes.
amazing. That's
That
exactly it. Just
mhm.
yeah, let's think about what this is producing in
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know? And, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I guess we're right here in that cross section of psychology and theology
Mm.
because we do wanna be emotionally aware, and we do wanna be attuned, and we do wanna name and validate feelings and all of those sorts of
Mhm.
things. And at the same time, maybe sometimes, like, stand back and let the suffering happen a little,
Mm.
let the character develop a little, and,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
that's just tricky. That's tricky,
Mhm.
right? To get that right.
Yeah,
Or not even get it right, but just do it okay,
yeah,
like, okay-ish.
Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway, let's I'll keep on with this because yeah, like, I see your book behind you as well, The
Mhm.
Discipline of Suffering, and we're wondering if you can share some narrative, some story from the book that really kind of like maybe, yeah, story time, like walk us through it a little bit from like what suffering through to peace is and lessons that we can learn from that experience. And um, you know, like I know like a lot of this is about your experience and not necessarily sort of other people, or it's not an academic text necessarily. So whatever you feel open
Yep.
to sharing, yeah,
So I'll try and weave two together.
sure, yeah.
So part of my faith story is that I became a Christian in a intentional way. So having grown up in a Christian family, a very classic story, right? But there's a
Mm,
difference between that and having it in your culture and actually choosing to follow.
Mm.
And
yeah.
part of what happened when I was around the ages 14, 15, I had like severe pain and missed a lot of school. And
Mm.
I think that was the turning point for me about turning my faith and knowledge about God into something I lived out. And
Mm,
so for me, I didn't really feel like conviction of sin as my pathway into my faith. It was more through God being with me in my suffering that
mm,
my faith became real. And it's interesting
mm,
because Richard Rohr, who is near you guys,
Mm.
he talks in his book The Naked Now that there's two pathways to faith in
mm.
Christ. One is through love, and one is through suffering. And so
Mm.
for me,
Wow.
that second pathway was definitely the one I followed. And
Mm.
one of the most influential theologians of last century, Jurgen Moltmann, who only recently died this year,
Mm,
his testimony, which makes sense of his theology in a way that's quite profound, is that he was a prisoner of war. So he's German, prisoner of
Mm.
war in Scotland. And
mm,
when the war ended, he was really confronted with the images of the Holocaust and really went into a phase of despair and suffering, not just because he was traumatized from fighting in the war, but also because of trying to make sense of, well, who am I then? If I'm German, who am I? It sort of broke his
Yeah.
identity. And
Mhm.
so
mm,
in that camp, he was able to read and be introduced to all these Christian books and read a lot of theological books that
mm,
actually led to his conversion. And
mm,
his understanding of God also was Jesus Christ is my brother in suffering. So
Mm.
that's core to
mm.
his theology. So therefore the core of his
Wow.
theology is the cross.
Mm.
And you
Mm.
see that in
Yes.
all of his theology and writing. And somewhere you'll find the cross right in the
Wow.
middle. And
Yeah.
it's
Wow.
even though we call out to God, why have you forsaken me? That
Mm,
actually is
Mhm.
mirrored in Jesus dying on the cross.
Mhm.
So even though we
mm.
don't really think about it this way, all of the pain and suffering of the world through all of history all intersects with the cross and Jesus bearing
Mm.
that pain and feeling that pain in a way that's way deeper than what we'll ever experience as
Yeah.
individuals. And
Yes.
that's what makes sense. So the hope
Yes.
of the resurrection is therefore the
Mm.
new life that we get, the hope that that provides, and that gives us
Mm.
a way forward, a way to make sense
Yeah.
of it. But
Mhm.
you don't want to split
Yeah.
the two apart because they actually all happen in that one event. So
Mm.
I just encourage people. I know systematic theology textbooks are dry and hard to read, but
Mm.
he's actually
Mm.
published a lot of easier to read books, and if people want to delve deeper,
Yeah.
they can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that the Richard Rohr text or the
Jurgen
Jurgen?
Moltmann, he's got a whole lot of books
Yeah.
that
Mm.
are not so heavy to read, that are
Yes.
quite
Yeah.
accessible. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that
Let's
Oh, go ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead, Abe.
No, we'll just get some resources
Yes.
up about those because I think that's so good. And like I don't know, like there's feelers, right, and experiential type people, and then there's like I need that,
Yeah.
like what you're talking about, and I really need to get into that. I need to understand that. I need to dissect, exegete that,
Mhm.
so I can believe around that.
Mm. Well, and I think you're inviting kind of like a I don't know, like a what's the word I'm looking for? This. You're you're inviting the 2 worlds to come together, the
Yeah.
thinker and the feeler by, like, even reading through systematic theology, books or books around that, and then applying it to your own life, like, feeling like, seeing your own
Mm,
life in that, seeing your life in the
mm,
suffering, knowing that Christ is thinking about us, knowing the suffering that we are in, and came down and put himself in immense suffering for us so
Yeah.
we can have eternal suffering. So, like, really,
yeah,
like, it sounds like really even meditating on that, like, that I am not alone in my suffering and, like, that could be something that
yeah,
helps in those moments, and helps
yeah,
re-identify you.
yeah.
Mm,
And I think we're gonna have to get people to read your book because I want to ask about like the
yeah.
processes that happen, but I think that's why we, the book exists, right? Um,
Mhm.
of just like your suffering going through and going through to a place of God is good and he loves me.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And through this suffering, it doesn't delete him or make him a bad
Mm,
God. He's
yeah.
still a loving God.
Yeah.
Um, oh, that's just powerful faith,
Yes.
to trust in his character like that.
Yeah.
One of my frustrations is that there's not enough tools for the regular Christian to integrate all of the knowledge
Mm,
that's out there because
Mhm.
it's
mm,
too inaccessible, too hard to understand. You don't know where to look for
mm.
it. And
Yep.
so with all the things I am
Mhm.
writing now in the Christian space, it's giving people that integration that they need to
Mm,
make sense of things
Wow.
that's
and
awesome.
to bring in that systematic theology where it's relevant or to make sense of why did psychology say mindfulness was a good thing and should we be
Mm,
practicing it? All of those tricky
mm.
questions that if you're not
Yep.
someone that works in that discipline or you don't have enough education, you're going to really struggle to make sense of it. So
Mhm.
my books, um, when I go into our Christian bookshops here in Australia, the same is the problem, right? They're either pitched too high or they say in 3 simple steps, your life will
Yes.
be
Uh,
transformed.
yeah.
Now that does
Yeah.
not happen
I
because
wish.
No.
otherwise I would not be a therapist and I'd be out
Right,
of a job,
yeah,
right? People
Yeah,
could
we
just
wouldn't
exactly.
get the
need it.
book.
Yep.
So
Right.
Yes. Absolutely. Yep, you're so right. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, trying to, like, have a section in the bookshop that kinda has Dr. Catherine's, like,
Yeah.
bridge between those
yeah,
things. Yeah, I think we're
Oh,
trying to do the same thing in a way, aren't we, Andrea?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
and and seeing the challenge of that, like,
yeah,
Yeah,
that's so it's hard.
creating a new life.
Cultural challenge as well, like, we're in Portland, Oregon,
Mhm,
you're in Melbourne, Victoria. There's just so many levels of, oh man, like translation
yeah,
maybe?
mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. But I think kinda going back to your book, you really encourage readers to embrace the suffering for spiritual growth. So what we're talking about, so, like, even
yeah.
moving, like, beyond that suffering and, um, how can Christians cultivate a mindset that views suffering not just as a trial, but as an opportunity? And I think you're kind of speaking to that a little bit, but if there's anything else you want to say to that of the opportunity to grow in
Yeah.
faith and peace.
Mm.
We will all at some point hit a place in our life where we get stuck.
Yeah.
Even if we're therapists and we've got all the training, we're still gonna get
Mm.
stuck. And
Yeah.
so
Yes.
the beauty of the church is you don't have to do this by yourself.
Mhm.
So I think it's about not trying to do it by yourself, not being shamed into being silenced and to actually share our experiences. I think we gotta get better at that. And
Yeah.
story's a
Mm.
great vehicle that you can do
Mm.
that through in a safe way. And sharing our stories, like sharing the good news, sharing our testimonies about God, isn't it? But to do it
Yeah.
intentionally, like for myself, I have built a group of people around me to keep me
Mm.
accountable, keep me on track. So I have my
Mm.
professional supervision, I have a mentor that's a minister, so they
Mm.
keep me on track. And then I have
Yeah.
other people, like just thinking about other things that are just generally in our churches, like going to a regular Bible study group where God's Spirit can speak through those people to you. Like
Mhm.
it's so important and
Mm.
trying to be intentional about that because we can't actually go through suffering by ourselves. We're not meant to.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's just
Mm.
not helpful.
Here's that common thing. This is something we've heard in pretty much every
Yep.
episode, especially when it comes to the fruit of the spirit and moving towards that is community. You
Yep.
need others around you. You need to be
Yep.
open to not just yes, the Holy Spirit, being a part of that, being that, but then also opening yourself up to the body of Christ.
And in this like project me era, right, where it's like self-development,
Mm.
self-care, self
Mhm.
whatever, it's like kind of like feels like the message at the moment is together, like together we do this,
Mhm.
Mm,
and every time, even though that happens, Andrea, every single time, maybe as a white man, um, I hear it and I go, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, I
Mhm.
need to do that more. I need
Mhm.
to lean into that more."
Yeah.
I haven't been doing that enough,
Mhm.
and my most favorite years of the last sort of 5 years were in COVID with my group of 3 other guys, 4 of us meeting in Dave's shed
Mm.
because we were social distancing and, just getting real with each other, and that
Mm.
was just precious,
Mm.
and it's like kind of COVID ended our special time,
Aw.
and it's just like if you're listening to this, you could just kind of like, yeah, 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 yeah. You could easily just sort of
Yeah.
like forget
Mhm.
that, like that's you who's listening. Like, talk to us, just go and show up and get vulnerable and say the things. And if you feel yourself checked out of the thing, actually, I think that's a Brene Brown quote about
mm,
how if we're living half-heartedly, we're tired, but wholehearted engagement in the thing
yep,
energizes you.
yep.
And I can
Mm.
speak to that. We just did a marriage course where we really showed up because our relationship was struggling,
Mhm.
and we were like in like just getting maybe too vulnerable. I don't know, but we left that
Mm.
so much better for it.
Mm.
Um and yeah, our testimony wasn't fun for like it was like it's embarrassing. Like we have stuff, that we shared that
Mhm.
was was great. And I was like, from what we've heard, it impacted other people. Like they
Mm.
Mm,
were like, hey, actually, we've been through that too. And
Love it.
probably tagging on with that,
Mhm.
just with practices and habits to have in place and I guess we've been talking a bit about being a receiver of peace, but also being a provider
Mm.
of peace. Because that's the fruit of the spirit too, isn't it? That
Mhm.
like,
yep.
wow, like yeah. So I guess we're just curious about any things, practices, habits, or ideas that are effective in both being a receiver but also a conduit of
Mm.
the peace of God.
So for me, I think, which will be different for other people, but for me,
Yeah.
it is to get back into those wild spaces. Like if I'm
Mm.
really struggling, to
Mm.
go to a national park, to go to the ocean, to sit there and just be still
Mhm.
Mm.
because then there's no distraction from listening. And so it's back to that Mary and Martha dilemma. Like,
Mhm.
actually do something to make sure that you can actually stop and be silent. But you don't have to do it to that extreme. So I love just going outside. So gardening for me is also a great outlet. But
Mm.
to have
Mm.
spaces outside my house where I can just sit there, or I'll go to a park in the city if I haven't got the
Mm.
time to drive further and
Mhm.
just sit there in nature. And
Yep.
we can all do that. Doesn't matter where we live, even if we've got to catch a train or bus to get there, we can do it. And I
Mm.
think it's about being intentional because we need to just take time out because our
Mm.
phones are like the worst enemy in our culture. And second to that, I'd say our computers.
Mhm,
Mhm.
So
mhm.
it's not
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah,
Not at all.
totally.
Not at all.
Yeah, it's like you're saying you can't fake peace, like,
Yeah.
well, how do you be someone who feels and provides peace? You have to be at
Yeah.
peace.
Yep.
Like,
Yeah.
and it's I remember the thing I used to say to parents of young children is like, if you're trying to regulate the baby, you have to be regulated.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like you can't regulate a baby when you're not regulated. So what are you going to do to regulate yourself?
Yeah.
How do you
And
teach children how to regulate themselves? You practice by modeling them to
Yeah.
them, and that might mean taking the whole family out to a wild space so that everyone's still.
yeah,
They learn
Mm.
it
yeah,
by us doing it with
Mhm.
them, I think.
I mean, this can be something for listeners is thinking about, like, personally, like, what are things in their life that bring them to a place of peace? And then how can they share that with others? How can they invite others into that, you know? And everybody will have
man.
something that vibes with them differently.
Mm.
Trying to think of mine. I mean, I love the ocean. I love the ocean
Mm,
and just
mm,
not just the beauty, but also just the sound of the waves. It's like, okay, like this was created. Like he has the world in his hands. He holds the wind and the waves. Like what? Like things like that where
mhm,
it's just like humbles, slows, makes me small in a good way. And that kind of is something that brings me peace and it brings me so much joy to see my daughter. She loves the beach.
mm,
She can be outside all day long. She just loves it, and it's just so
mm.
beautiful. And I wasn't being intentional about that, but I was just like, "Oh, great. I'm glad you love it too," you know?
Accidental. Yeah,
But
yeah.
I think that's an example of, like, inviting others.
Man,
How about for you, Abe? Is
it's
there
good.
something for you that
I was thinking the same thing. I was actually thinking about my wife though,
mm,
because life's busy, couple of kids, all of that kind of thing. And then when she's at the beach,
mm.
she's just chilling.
Oh, nice.
And it's different. They call it the coast here.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Um,
Mhm.
it's the Oregon coast, and if you go to the beach, it's usually like a river bank, right?
Oh,
Or I
I
think,
don't know. I'm from Southern
uh,
California,
you're
so
from the beach.
we got the beach, but
Yeah,
yeah,
it's the
here is
beach.
the
It's the beach down
coast.
there.
Yes.
But yeah, if you say the beach here, and people think you mean the river,
Mm.
and then so we go to the coast,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
yeah, that's it. Like we're chill. Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I'm kind of chill because she is,
Mhm.
and then the kids are because we both are, and
Yeah.
it may be different again to Victoria life. I'm not sure about there, but from Perth, it's like you go to the beach for 20 minutes, you just have a dip, and you go. Yeah, where here it's like you go for the day.
Yes, you
So you're like.
spent time driving there, you better stay.
Yeah, you pack a picnic, and so it's like a whole day of unwinding,
Mhm.
which is good. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other, like, wisdom, Dr. Catherine, that you would share about peace, just having peace in suffering in particular?
I think the biggest lesson is just to keep persevering. It is a discipline.
Mm.
And every time I feel panicked or get really stressed out, that's my reminder with my picture that's connected to that
Mm.
in my mind about Mary sitting down and just being
Mm.
still.
Mm,
And the one that's really spoken to me this year is about, it comes out of, I think it's, I wrote it down because I thought your listeners might actually want to know. So if
Mm.
you read Psalm 91, it talks about being sheltered by God's wings, which is such a lovely
Mm.
image. And
mm,
birds actually do put their chicks under their wings. And
Mm.
mm,
so I think that's what God invites us to do when we're having a really tough time. What are
Yeah.
you doing panic about this when I am your refuge and I am
Mm.
your shelter and you're like a chick and you're meant to just go under the wings and
Wow.
sometimes you'll be under there for like 6 months, who knows? It might be just for
yeah.
today. But to choose to actually go there,
Mm.
because it is a choice, because we can either stay
Yeah.
in that panic situation and be distressed, or we can choose to take that and hide under God's wings and be safe there and wait
Mm.
for Him to show us what to do.
It's
To
like we resist that for some reason. I'm not allowed to rest, or I'm not
Uh,
allowed to do that. And it's like you're invited to actually. And
yeah.
yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
important. Yeah.
absolutely. My refuge.
Mhm.
Seeing that it's the right way to be. In fact, it's even bigger than an invitation. Like that's where we are supposed to be.
Yeah.
That's where we'll be
Yeah.
the safest. And then
Yeah.
that's where we will find peace.
Yeah.
Is when we're
Yeah.
in
It's so good.
refuge. Yeah.
I feel peaceful, like just talking about like that
Yeah.
wasn't the goal
Yeah.
necessarily, like to get all like peaceful and meditative, but
Mhm.
thank you. Like that was so, and it sounds like, we were trying to find what the right like kind of fruit of the spirit for talking about suffering was, and this is
Oh my
just
gosh.
perfect. Like sounds like it was
Yeah.
just right on with what
Perfect
you've
pair.
been learning about and teaching and writing about. And so thank you, Dr. Catherine. That was awesome.
I was
Yeah.
just
Really
going to
appreciate
say,
it.
too, that this book, which you probably saw in the background,
Yes.
this
Mhm.
Yeah.
is actually to help people learn the discipline of just sitting still. And
Yeah.
it
Okay.
Okay.
actually
I'm looking.
uses metaphors from the ocean, which we've talked about
Oh,
today,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
which
okay.
is
Oh,
very
okay.
Australian.
Interesting.
Um,
Yes.
but your listeners will identify with it as well, because it
Yeah.
doesn't matter,
Yeah.
as long as you've got access to the ocean, that you'll understand them.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
to
Wow.
give you a few therapy tools that are integrated with faith, so that you can actually try to put it into practice in a really concrete way.
And your other book, Breathe,
Yeah.
Mhm.
that's that that has that made a bit of headway in America, because I feel like I've seen it around here a little bit.
I actually don't
Or
know. So
yeah,
we've
right. Okay.
also put another one out, which is called
Yep.
Abide, which came out this month, but people can
Okay.
buy it online. And then next
Yep.
year there's a fourth one coming out, which is called Be. So we've tried to pick
Mm.
them, sort of
Yeah.
tease out
Wow.
topics so that people can just pick them up. They don't have to know
Uh-huh.
any theory. They can just
Yeah.
grab the practical tools and
Mm.
put them into practice.
Can we we will obviously put some links up and all of
Yeah.
that.
Mm.
What's the best way to find you? Is it like your website or just on Amazon or
Yeah, you can just get them easily now. If you just put Google the titles into the internet,
yeah.
you'll be able to buy
Okay.
them on multiple platforms
Sure.
now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh?
Well, thank you so much. We probably should
Thank
finish up.
you.
Appreciate you just taking the time
Yeah.
and to meet with us, but also just to the gift of your mind and what you're
Mhm.
doing, the gift of your life, your testimony and what
Yeah.
you've learned. And,
Yeah, you're doing some great
yeah.
stuff. But
Thanks for
yeah.
inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the show, everyone. Make sure you like us on Instagram. No, you don't like us on Instagram. Everyone, you know
But
what we're
you
saying.
should like us on Instagram and follow us.
Follow us on
You should go
Instagram.
above and beyond.
Yeah. Follow us on Spotify or Apple and tell your
Share our
friends.
content.